Welcome to the next interview for YA Thriller Con. I'm joined today by Marta Pacini, and I'm really excited to be talking with you. We're going to be talking about your latest book, obviously, and then sort of like thrillers in general and sort of writing processes. And of course, you founded your own publishing company, which is so exciting. And I've got so many questions for you about that. Firstly, thank you so much for joining me. And would you like to introduce yourself to our viewers?
Yes. Hi, I'm Marta Pacini. I'm the founder of Disturbance Press. My latest book is actually not a YA, so I'll be talking about my first. My latest book is called Conspiracy, but it's more geared towards an adult audience, whereas The Unlawful Killing of Daniel Brown is very much geared towards young adult. So that's what I'll be talking about. I founded Disturbance Press about a year ago and published these two books both this year in 2022, and now I've got some other authors' books that I'm working on, so it's exciting.
Oh, that does sound really fascinating. And yeah, I've got so many questions to sort of like delve into the whole publishing process when we get to that part of this conversation. Firstly, if you'd like to tell us more about your YA book then, and I'd also love to know about like what made you sort of switch between YA and adult, seeing as you write for both readerships.
When I first started writing The Unlawful Killing of Daniel Brown, I didn't know it was going to be a YA book. I didn't know it was going to be a thriller. I didn't know a lot about it again. I just started writing it and then it took me where it did. But I ended up giving it a 15-year-old main character. And seeing as it's written solely from his point of view, then it made sense to use the kind of language that he would use in his everyday life and talk about the kind of concerns that a 15-year-old would use. And the more I wrote, the more I realized this is a YA book. And whereas with Conspiracy, I don't know, I think I wanted a change. And that's purely why I decided, okay, let's write an adult book now. It wasn't anything more than that. I just wanted to write about something very different in a different tone with different characters, just because I like to explore different things. But The Unlawful Killing is a very special book to me. I know I've only written two, but still. It came about when I was thinking about a conversation I had when I visited the States. And somebody there had heard about a black man who was shot dead by police in the UK. I think she was probably referring to Mark Duggan. There have been several, but Mark Duggan was probably the most famous one because of the riots that ensued. And this person said to me, I thought police in the UK didn't carry guns. And I said, yes, they don't normally, but sometimes they do. And that's how this case happened. And I didn't know anything more than that at the time. But for some reason, I was thinking about that conversation again a few years later. And it struck me that that's the perception that we have in the UK of police as fairly non-threatening, at least compared to stories that we hear from the States.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm sure that that perception is not completely correct because, you know, I've seen police do some quite nasty things. I was a student in London in 2013 to 16, and I saw police react to student protests in really unnecessarily violent ways.
Okay.
And so I thought somebody needs to point this out to people. And that somebody ended up being me through this story. So it was very much a let's write a story to make a point and raise awareness of something that I don't think a lot of people have awareness of. And while researching the book, I found out that actually for a few years, the police use of firearms has been on the rise. I think it then declined again, but it was on the rise for a few years. Um, had been at least in 2020 when I first started writing the book. And so, yeah, it just ended up being a very timely and topical thing to write about.
Yeah, definitely. And it sounds like a really important book to raise this awareness because, like I was saying, in the UK, you don't really hear much about sort of police brutality, especially with sort of like violence involving guns being involved. Like when we hear about that in the media, it is very much centered on the United States and events happening over there. So, yeah, like raising awareness about it happening in the UK is important as well. Um, yeah, so what has the response been from readers about your book and about this issue then? Like, has readers reacted in the way that you were hoping when you put out this book?
Yes, it's been extremely positive in the sense of, I've had reviewers saying people need to read this book
Mhm.
because, everybody needs to know about this. I have a friend who's a secondary school teacher in Australia, actually, and she's ordered a bunch of copies for her school library, and we recorded an interview for her to share with her writing group, creative writing group of
Mhm.
teenagers at the school that she works at. And she was saying the same thing that, I think people have liked the book because it raises awareness of
Mhm.
certain issues that are not particularly talked about. And that's exactly what I set out to do. So, in that sense, I consider it a success.
Oh, that's great then. Yeah, because it's always good when you get like positive responses from readers, but then you also feel that you're sort of like fulfilling your own goal in writing a book. Because I know when I'm writing, I'm always writing a book for a specific reason. So if I feel that I've achieved something with it, then I don't know, it almost feels like a book of my heart rather than just sort of like one that I'm writing just like anyway. It's like the ones that have more sort of personal meaning to me are always more important. And obviously, it sounds like this is a really important book to you, like as you've just said. Um, yeah, so talking more specifically about thrillers and sort of the different tropes associated with thrillers and the different conventions of within this genre, what are your favourite sort of tropes or expectations within the thriller genre? Perhaps when you're reading a thriller or even watching a movie that is a thriller, sort of what do you look out for?
Oh, interesting. I'm not sure if I look out for tropes, or maybe
Okay.
the thing that I look out for is for tropes to be subverted.
Yeah.
A subversive person. There's a thriller. I won't say what it's called because this is the spoiler of all spoilers. But keeping it very vague, one of my favorite thrillers that I ever read had the person who was doing the investigating turned out to be the murderer. And I honestly did not see that coming in the
Mhm.
slightest. And not only that, but the person who had been accused of the murder knew it and kind of almost made their peace with it. So that is not how I expected it to go.
Mhm.
And and from the start, this thriller was set up a bit differently because there was somebody already in prison for this murder, and
Mhm.
the whole thing was being dug up again. And yeah, that really stayed with me. And thinking about it, actually, I've just finished editing a book by Aaron Cogley called An Inquiry into Innocence, which is going to come out in early 2023 from Disturbance Press.
Mhm.
It also does a similar thing in the sense that somebody's been in prison for 7 years for a crime, and now we're revisiting the crime and interrogating whether he actually did it or not. So maybe that's something that I'm drawn to.
Yeah, I love sort of like any sort of subversion of tropes and unreliable narrators. Like they are my favorite kinds of narrator. And like even like sometimes I'll go into a book and I'll know that it's an unreliable narrator because I'll either have like heard from reviewers, oh, this is such a great unreliable narrator, or like even the main character will say up front that they're lying about certain things. And I just love sort of like that complex, kind of like dark, morally grey character. Like those are the characters that really appeal to me in YA thrillers. So yeah, would you ever sort of like write a YA thriller with sort of like an unreliable narrator, do you think?
Oh yeah, I would. That would be hugely fun. actually, because both the books that I've written so far have been very much about um, trying to put things out there. There's procedural bits about the law, and there's morals and values that certain characters are trying to push, and other characters are pushing against. And it's all been very much let's try and find what's right, let's try and find what's true. And actually, it would be so fun and so interesting to put that all aside and have a main character, especially if they're the narrator, who just isn't into that. And maybe even lets you think that they're into that, but they're actually not.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like I have so much fun when I'm writing unreliable narrators. So like to find someone else that also would love to write one, I'm just like so happy right now. Yeah, so you just mentioned about sort of like getting police procedural correct when you're writing, and obviously that's really important in any of the crime sort of subgenres. So like do you have a specific process for that in terms of like research and fact checking?
I definitely do a lot of research. I I guess I pay attention to what sources I'm using, and I always try and use um, official ones. So if I'm researching how the Met Police do a certain thing, I'll try the Met Police website first,
Yeah.
and as close a source that's as close to that as possible. So trying to make sure that I'm not just basing my research off somebody's opinion.
Yeah.
At the same time, uh, if you're researching things like the police, and especially things like police racism and brutality, it's really important to also read up on people's personal experiences with it.
Yeah.
Of course, the police website is not going to have a section on this is how people feel when we mistreat them, we're racist to them. So I've watched documentaries and read accounts of people who have been or their family members have been mistreated by police, and sort of gone from there and tried to take that into account and incorporate it into writing.
Yeah, that's obviously so important just to sort of like get the representation correct. Not only sort of like factual representation, but the representation of experiences, like you're saying. It's important to get those across accurately. So yeah, I'd love to talk a bit about your actual like writing processes, because whenever I'm chatting to any writer, I'm always like really interested to hear what their process is like, because I find that so many of us, we have so many different ways that we write, and obviously there's no one correct way to write, and I think just sort of like talking more about it can be really helpful for new writers who are watching this as well, just to sort of like understand that there's not like the one way to write. So yeah, do you plot your books, or do you just sort of like wing it?
I plot. I think in general in life, I like to know what's going on and what the
Yeah.
plan is, and that translates to my writing. It doesn't mean that I know for a fact how the plot is going to go at the beginning. I might think I know, but the plot always changes. It does. I was going to say get away from it, but it's not even that. It just develops in its own way, and then I have to try and keep up with it. But I do start by plotting, at least in general terms. Then I create the characters second, I think, really.
Okay.
I sort of create them based on the plot. Although, as I write, the characters develop more, and then the character development can then influence the plot itself.
Right.
Because when I first start plotting, I might not know a lot about what these characters are going to be like. And as I develop them, I'll realize actually that character wouldn't do that thing. It's just not in character for them.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna have to change that plot point to make it fit with the character. So they do feed off each other a lot.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And obviously we can't sort of like look at these things like in a vacuum, because they are affected by each other. Like I don't plot at all, so I'm kind of the opposite to you. I just go straight in, just dive in, see where my writing takes me. But then I suppose I do kind of plot for my second draft, because once I got to the end of my first draft, I know the shape of the story and I know my characters. So then I'm just sort of like getting everything in order then. So I guess I kind of do my plotting after I've done like my discovery draft. But yeah, like what you're saying totally makes sense. And I love how you sort of like emphasize that these things do sort of like interlock together and one will affect the other, because you can't sort of like do each stage in isolation.
Yeah.
So how long does it take you to sort of like write a first draft then?
Gosh, months. Even though both my books have been really short, it still takes months to do it, several months.
Yeah.
I'm a very slow writer, but then I'm fairly quick at editing. I've realized that I really don't do what the most of the advice I've read, which is, in your first draft, don't worry about style, grammar, this, that. Just get the stuff down. And I don't know, I just can't do it. I try, and then I end up thinking, what word would go well here, even though it's my first draft. But what I have realized is that I don't end up with a super messy draft. It's messy, but also reasonably polished. So I think I make up time in the latter stages.
Yeah, that makes sense. It does sound like quite a time efficient way to do it, because I know when I do like my really first messy draft that makes no sense whatsoever, most of it kind of doesn't end up being used. So I'm just sort of like writing about 50,000-60,000 words that just then never like get used at all, not even like edited, just sort of like loads of scenes that don't make sense. So yeah, yours sounds like a much more efficient way, much easier to do in that respect. Yeah, so let's talk about your publishing company next then. So sort of like, how did you get started doing this, and did you always want to set up a publishing company?
No, I didn't always want to, although I've always been attracted to the idea of starting a business. But no, I started writing Dialogue Killing and thought that I would submit it to publishers, in a traditional way. And then I was looking up, I was quite keen on the idea of a small publisher, first of all, because they're easier to get in with. And then I just thought, because of the theme of the book and the fact that it's quite a short book, which is not exactly commercially appealing. I don't know why, but a lot of books these days, especially thrillers, seem to be those types. So I thought, I'll look for a small independent publisher, one of the ones that you deal with directly, where you don't need an agent, because who knows whether an agent would want to represent me. And I couldn't find much in the way of publishers that focus on social justice fiction. I just, for some reason, thought that it exists. It turns out there's a couple that I found later on, one that wasn't doing novels at the time, although they are now, and a couple of others that kind of have that as a semi-focus but don't really say it.
Okay.
But I thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a publisher that specifically and explicitly focused on that? And I knew that there were several fairly successful non-fiction publishers on the sort of left side of the political spectrum that did quite well. And I thought, surely these people must also enjoy fiction.
Yeah.
At least some of them some of the time. And anyway, it was 2020, it was lockdown. I was working a remote job that paid very little and wasn't very fulfilling, and I was bored. And so I decided to go for it, and I enrolled in a publishing master's course. And yeah, that's how I got started.
Wow. So yeah, it sounds like you really sort of found this niche area then, that there's just like this lack of publishing companies really sort of focusing on that thing, and you've stepped in. So you mentioned that you're publishing other people's books as well. So are you currently open to submissions from any writers who might be watching this interview and thinking that, yes, my book is about social justice as well?
Yes, absolutely. Anybody who's based in the UK or Ireland who's writing in any genre really, other than horror, purely because I just really dislike horror, and it's only me working here at the moment.
Right. Okay.
With some sort of social justice or environmental justice content, it doesn't have to be preachy, I know I have a tendency to make things quite preachy, and I did say in the panel um, that we recorded the other day that I think writing in the thriller genre has helped me keep the preachiness to a minimum.
Yeah.
So I'm glad about that. But it could be, lots of different genres. It could be quite subtle, or it could be quite direct and explicit in any case.
Mm.
But yeah, there's submission guidelines on the website, disturnexpress.co.uk.
Wonderful. So, yeah, I mean, what you were saying about sort of like about if something is a thriller, it does sort of like take away the tendency for something to be preachy. Because I guess when you're writing a thriller, sort of the idea of it being entertainment as well as action and like keeping the tension up and pacing, that's kind of like the forefront of your mind when you're writing it, even if you are actually writing about a really important issue, such as the ones that we've already mentioned. So do you have any sort of tips for any writers that are writing about these really important issues that are really close to their hearts, but also want to sort of like keep an eye on tension and pacing?
Yes, I would say try and incorporate the issues into the story as much as possible rather than making it an aside.
Mm.
Make it central to the story, and then you'll have tension because
Yeah.
with justice issues there's always tension. So, so that's easy. And the other thing I would say, although that's more to do with character and less to do with tension and pacing, is to make your characters really human and make them three-dimensional, so they don't have to just be this person who's affected by this issue. You
Mm-hmm.
know, they can, and I think they should also have love interests or hobbies,
Yeah.
or whatever the kind of stuff that you put in a subplot
Mm-hmm.
to vary the pace, to go back to pace. Just so just so it's clear that they're real people with real lives that just happen to be affected by a certain issue at a certain time.
Yeah, that's such an important thing. Just sort of like making sure that the characters are always well rounded and that you're not just using a character as a tool in a way just to sort of like introduce one issue, but you're thinking of them as an actual character. Yeah, sort of like linking to this. I know one question that I always get asked a lot whenever I'm sort of like doing lectures on writing and characterization in particular. Like people always want to know what tips you have for creating villains. So I thought I'd ask you this question as well to get your input on that. So like how would you create a realistic but also terrifying villain that like readers just like love to hate?
Yeah. I think a villain would also have a backstory that shines through in some places, and um, things about them that are not necessarily villainous,
Yeah.
as well as things that are. I think that makes them more relatable, and when
Mm-hmm.
villains are more relatable, I think that's when people like them particularly. So, in my second book, Conspiracy, uh, essentially there's a queen and a prime minister who are not the actual ones that we have, they're fictional, and they basically orchestrate a power grab. And so the queen, at one point, I talk about her and her closest friend, who's a lady in waiting, having cream tea, and how one of them puts the strawberry jam on the scone first and then the cream, and the other does it the other way around, which is an endless debate.
Yeah.
And and that's in there purely because readers will be able to relate to the debate, first of all, if they've ever spent any time in England. And also, it's just one of those little things that make
Mm.
you see this character as more human and
Yeah.
rounded. Yeah, and I think the other thing is, I don't know, making it possible for readers to see things from the villain's point of view. So with this
Mm-hmm.
queen, I had a lot of fun trying to sort of explore her psychology and think about why she does what she does and why she changes in the way she changes
Mm-hmm.
throughout the book. Because at the beginning, she's very much getting on with things as normal, and then she spots an opportunity to grab more power, And she kind of goes for it and goes, why not? Why shouldn't I do all these things myself rather than leave them to the government and to other organizations in the way that we, come to associate with a democratic type monarchy. So, yeah, I think maybe asking yourself, why are they doing what they're doing? What are they thinking at this moment? And then letting that shine through.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, because obviously when we're writing villains, their actions have to make logical sense for what they want to achieve, and it's not just that they've got to do stuff in order to get in the way of the protagonist, but it's got to actually make sense for like their own sort of character arc and their own story. Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I love how you got in the debate about like clotted cream or jam, whichever comes first. Like, I'm in Devon, and like Devon versus Cornwall is just kind of like this constant battle over that, about which way to do that. So yeah, as soon as you mentioned that, I was like, instant connection. And yeah, that's kind of what we want with all characters when we're reading, not just like with the protagonist, but with the antagonist, the villainous characters, and even the more minor characters as well. Because I guess sometimes, particularly sort of like newer writers, when they're just sort of starting out, they put so much emphasis and work into making their protagonist realistic and their antagonist realistic, but sometimes the sort of secondary characters can feel a bit one-dimensional then. So yeah, I just sort of like think, whatever you're doing for the main characters, do it for like pretty much all the characters, and particularly for like characters of importance as well. So yeah, as we're talking about writing advice, do you have any other bits of advice that you'd like to share with the viewers?
Oh, goodness. I think one thing I've learned is to know when to stop, to know when you've done enough work on your book and it's probably good enough. Then show it to a few people, then take their feedback, then implement it, then it will be good enough. So, I definitely think, beta readers have a huge place, but I would say don't spend years trying to write your masterpiece and spend months on that particular word, because do you know what, once it gets to an editor, things will get changed anyway.
Yeah.
I sent huge lists of edits to some of my authors who are like, ouch. But it's because you need a second set of eyes, at least,
Yeah,
if not more than four,
definitely.
to spot things that are not even, they don't have to be mistakes, but even just way that the book could be made even better. And you just can't spot those yourself. So I would say, yes, polish a lot and get other people's feedback, but at some point, believe in your work and send it out.
Yeah, that is just such good advice. And obviously, just having that sort of belief in yourself and like this self-confidence when you are writing does help a lot, because obviously if you are going with traditional route, you're going to be sort of like querying for like, well, several years, and there will be a lot of rejections, and just sort of knowing that the rejections don't mean that you're a bad writer, because like books will be rejected from publishers for like so many different reasons that have like no actual reflection on your own ability as a writer. So I think, yeah, if you just sort of like believe in yourself and trust yourself, as you're saying, that's just like really important, and sort of like knowing exactly what you want to do with the book and like why you're writing it is also really, really helpful. Yeah, so before we go, I would love to know what your favorite books are, sort of like top book. If you had to recommend one book to any person, which would you pick?
Ooh, that is a hard question.
I know it is a really tricky question, and that's why I love asking it to people.
Because books are so, diverse. So it's really difficult to just pick one. I'm going to go with Nation by Terry Pratchett, which is a YA. So there you go. Although it's a thriller. I think the reason I picked that one is because, I talked about Terry Pratchett in the panel as well. I'm honestly, I'm on a Terry Pratchett kick at the moment. But I think that his ability to talk about really huge issues with incredible humor, astounding, and Nation in particular, it's literally about the creation of community and trying to survive disasters and rebuild. There's such huge themes, and the way they're talked about in that book is both really funny and really profound and almost epic. You know, I can barely describe it. I think if a book is so good that I can barely describe why it's so good, then
Yeah.
that's probably a point in its favor.
Yeah, exactly. It just proves that it is like that caliber, like right up there. So good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining me for this interview. It's been really enlightening, and I just love hearing about your process. So would you just like to finish off by telling your readers where they can find you, your publishing company, and your books?
Yeah. So my publishing company is Distillers Press, distillerspress.co.uk. Um, Honestly, that's where you can find me as well. I've got a Goodreads page as well. But my books, are on the publishing company website, and you can order from wherever you like. But I like to plug. If you're going for ebooks, I like to plug Smashwords because it's kind of an independent platform.
Yeah.
It doesn't charge publishers and authors for using it. It just charges retailers at the other end. So I always like to plug them. And yeah, both myself and the publishing house are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So find us there. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you again for joining us for this exclusive interview for YA Thriller.